So we've got evidence that it's worth talking about the brain in terms of specific areas with localized functions. So let's zoom in and ask, what are these brain areas made of and how do they work? Around this same time, there was a fundamental shift happening in the way we think about biological organisms and whether we can use science to study them at all. For a lot of the 19th century, even the world's leading biologists weren't convinced that physical laws were going to be able to explain life. Biologists studied specific biological mechanisms and specific body parts, but they tended to believe in something called vitalism, which suggested that the organisms were more than the sum of their parts. They had these biological body parts, but they were all integrated and coordinated by a vital force, something that was beyond science, that made them alive in a way that simple biological matter couldn't be alive on its own. This was the atmosphere when Hermann von Helmholtz was cutting his teeth in science, and Hermann von Helmholtz is sort of like an early version of the New Atheists. He signed this materialist pledge with a bunch of buddies in school saying, we're going to explain everything without reference to any of these hand-wavy, woo-woo theories about vitalism. We're going to see what we can explain with the powers of science alone. One of Helmholtz's early cases against vitalism was also one of the first and most clear statements of the first law of thermodynamics, which is the conservation of energy. And Helmholtz argued that this vital force, at the time it was claimed that the vital force didn't only integrate the biological parts of an organism, but it added this vital heat or vital energy as a consequence of making the animal alive. And Helmholtz argued that if there was this vital heat that was being added that couldn't be explained by biology, we should be able to harness it and make a perpetual motion machine. But because physics had ruled out the possibility of a perpetual motion machine, Helmholtz argued that physics makes vitalism impossible. Helmholtz's main contribution that concerns us is his scientific study of the transmission of electrical signals across nerves. Helmholtz had been taught that nerve impulses travel instantaneously, that they were coordinated by this vital force, and you shouldn't bother to wonder about how this works. You accept it, there's instantaneous nerve transmission, and don't bother to study it beyond that. But Helmholtz was not satisfied with this vitalist explanation. So he wanted to see for himself if he could figure out how fast nerve impulses travel. So he grabbed a frog's leg muscle with a nerve attached to it, and an apparatus like this one here, and he stimulated the nerve electrically and measured how long it took between the stimulation of the nerve and the flexing of the muscle. And he found that it wasn't instantaneous. He estimated the speed at about 90 feet per second. So this was a major surprise to the vitalists who assumed that nerve impulses traveled instantaneously. Helmholtz found, on the contrary, that, well, it wasn't instantaneous and it was possible to study it, and he had an estimate. So this brought nerve impulses, which had been dogmatically excluded from the realm of science, into the realm of science, which is a great victory for neuroscience. If you've ever looked through a microscope at a human cell, chances are you didn't see very much, or you used a cell staining technique to increase the contrast. A lot of the parts of living cells are translucent. It's hard to see them. And so in the study of histology or microbiology, these techniques are developed to basically have something functioning like ink bind to whatever piece of the cell you're interested in, whether it's a certain type of receptor or the presence of a certain chemical. Camillo Golgi developed a technique like this, which he called the black reaction, which turned neurons black so they could easily be visualized for the purposes of drawings like this one here. And Golgi got a little bit cocky about this discovery. He writes, quote, "I am delighted that I have found a new reaction to demonstrate, even to the blind, the structure of the interstitial stroma of the cerebral cortex." One reason Golgi may have been excited about this discovery was that it could be used to prove his theory that all nerves were part of a single continuous mass. There was a single cytoplasm that was shared by all of the nerve fibers in the brain. Enter Santiago Ramon y Cajal, who in 1889 used Golgi's technique to show that neurons were not a continuous mass, but were distinct cells. This became known as the Neuron doctrine, which we're all familiar with today, just the idea that neurons are individual cells, as opposed to being a continuous mass. Here we have some of Cahal's famous early drawings that he drew using Golgi's staining technique. But Cahal was not done making a fool out of Golgi just yet. Not only did he use Golgi's own technique to disprove his theory about nerves, but he improved on Golgi's silver staining technique and developed his own technique to stain cells using gold. But it all worked out in the end. Golgi and Ramon Cajal split the Nobel Prize in 1906, and I think this is a great example of how science functions as an adversarial process. We think of scientists as a community, building on each other, but in reality, science, at least part of science, is a bunch of egomaniacs who are constantly trying to prove each other wrong and prove themselves right. And when two people have competing theories, this creates an incentive for really rigorous work demonstrating the correctness of your theory as opposed to someone else's theory. You know, we're in the midst of a replication crisis in psychology. People are finding that they can't reproduce the results of famous studies. And so in that climate, there has been an increase in grants calling for specifically adversarial collaborations. They want to get two people with competing theories and have them duke it out more or less in a collaborative but competitive process. And that's the type of thing that I like to see.